so I was asked to discuss some examples of cities that are really optimizing. Okay. So I was asked to put together a presentation looking at some examples of cities that have been optimizing Dockless Bikeshare over the past 18 months or so, and also identify some lessons learned that might be applied to other privately operated new mobility services. So I just want to start by giving a quick background on Dockless Bikeshare, sort of history, and how we got to where we are today. I also wanted to touch on why regulation is necessary, give a quick overview of a policy framework that ITBP has put together to help cities think more holistically about Dockless Bikeshare and other new mobility services. And then I'll spend most of the time talking about lessons that have started to emerge around regulating new mobility, and then we'll just wrap up and get to the discussion. So just quickly on a little bit of background for Dockless Bikeshare. As most of us probably know, the idea of dockless bikes isn't necessarily new. It's been a model that's used by a couple of different bike share companies, Bike in several European markets. It's been used by social bicycles in the US. But this newer concept of GPS-enabled bikes that users are able to access using their smartphones really emerged on a couple of university campuses here in China in 2014. These were relatively small, contained systems, and they were generally unregulated. And then over the next couple of years, after 2014, of course, Dockless Bikeshare started to explode in popularity in China. Companies started receiving these huge investments, funding to expand, and that, of course, led to companies dropping these huge fleets of bikes onto city streets in order to establish a user base and gain market share. And of course, that led to some of the issues that we know today around oversupply and other challenges. So by April of 2017, by July of 2017, Seattle releases the first comprehensive permit structure to actually require dockless operators to meet certain standards before they were actually able to operate in the city. This is sort of a novel approach. And after that, we saw a lot of cities start to emulate that model of preemptive regulation. And then by July of 2018, more than 250 cities around the world have either drafted or adopted dockless bikeshare regulations. And it's also around this time, in July of 2018, that OFO and Mobike announced that they would be exiting some US markets and other markets around the world. So now, nearing the end of 2018, a lot of these pilot programs that cities have started over the past year and a half or so are starting to come to a close, and cities are really starting to be in a position to identify and adopt more formal regulations for dockless bikeshare. So as far as the question around why we need to regulate, as dockless bikeshare really exploded in China and spread to other countries around the world, these major issues started to emerge that the market wasn't able to properly address. So oversupply was a big one. Like I mentioned, this was done as a strategy to capture market share, and we've all seen photos of oversupply leading to piles of bikes in public spaces around transit stations, and also what have been called bike graveyards. We saw some photos of that yesterday from our colleague at Mobike. There was also a lot of concern and issues of vandalism and discarded bikes that were left in public places and also on private property as well. And at the same time, cities were essentially completely unprepared. They didn't have policies in place to address these negative externalities. The only response that they really had was to issue cease and desists. And some cities did issue those cease and desists in response to rogue launching, like BlueGoGo launched without permission in a couple of US markets and were issued cease and desists. We saw this in some other cities. But cease and desists are a little bit problematic because that really just eliminates the option of this mode that could actually contribute to the broader transportation network. So there was really a need for action. So at this point, kind of in response to a lot of uncertainty around what cities should actually, what steps cities should actually take in order to regulate these services, ITDP put together this policy framework. I realize it's nearly impossible to read, but what's really important is that this framework is a way to encourage cities to think more holistically about Dockless Bikeshare, and it can actually also be applied to any other privately operated mobility service. And the goal is obviously to maximize the benefits of these services. So this framework pulls some concepts from adaptive management and dynamic adaptive policymaking, both of which are strategies that aim to reduce uncertainty in the future by building in approaches to system monitoring and adjustment, and really allow for flexibility in policy amending over time. So I just want to quickly go through each of these steps, and I'm going to talk about them more through the rest of the presentation. But that first step up at the top, right up here, is positioning bikeshare within city goals. So this is an approach towards outcome-oriented planning, where cities can really take a step back and think about how Dockless Bikeshare might act as a tool to help achieve existing goals that they've already committed to achieving, whether those are climate goals, mode share goals, any other type of kind of broad-scale goal that Dockless Bikeshare might help to contribute to. And then once those have been identified, then cities can start to think more narrowly about requirements that are actually going to address the negative impacts that could emerge from the Dockless system. And we categorize those sort of operations level objectives into these 4 categories. They're managing public space, fostering equity and accessibility, improving planning, and protecting users. And I'll talk about those in more detail in the next couple of slides. We also think it's really important that cities either hire or designate government staff to oversee Dockless Bikeshare management. And that sort of moves into this third step, which is part of a real-time real-time evaluation framework that includes monitoring and enforcement. And then the final step in the framework is this outer step, which is more of a periodic evaluation framework that allows cities to evaluate their policies based on both operator data and user feedback, and also gives them the flexibility to consider potential new technologies or emerging business models that might affect how the policies that have been implemented are working, and gives the opportunity to amend those policies if necessary over time. So I want to talk a little bit about some potential requirements that cities around the world have put in place in response to some of these negative externalities of Dockless Bikeshare. The first operations area that we talk about is public space management, and the major shortfalls to address here are obviously oversupply and parking issues. So cities have a variety of methods to address these issues. They could impose a fleet cap, whether that's dynamic or static, and that would effectively limit the supply of bikes in the city. They could implement a time-bound response to complaints of misparked bikes. A lot of cities give operators a couple of hours to respond to those complaints. They could require bikes to have a built-in lock that might help to reduce instances of bikes being tipped over or parked in the middle of the sidewalk. Or they could install designated parking areas. So obviously, all of these strategies are going to have slightly different costs. They're going to require different capacities as far as staff time around designing and implementing and enforcing them. And their need and success really is going to depend on existing conditions in the city. So again, context really matters here. So similarly, when we look at equity and accessibility, the main concerns that we have seen are around access for folks who don't have a smartphone or a credit card. And there's also concerns around a limited availability of bikes in lower density areas or places where people aren't necessarily taking trips to and leaving bikes there. So cities might require, in response to these concerns, more flexible or reduced payment options. So we've seen this in San Francisco, which requires operators to offer a cash payment option. They could require distribution requirements, which would require a certain percentage of bikes across all neighborhoods in the city or a certain percentage in certain neighborhoods. This can make the likelihood of finding a bike nearby more equitable across the city. Some cities have started to experiment with incentives, which usually are tied to allowing operators to have a larger fleet if those operators meet certain requirements related to serving designated underserved areas. And then lastly, integration between bikeshare and transit can also be an effort towards improving accessibility, particularly if reduced fare transfers are implemented. As far as I know, there aren't any systems that have implemented transit integration between Dockless bikeshare and transit. But this is a really kind of interesting opportunity, I think, for encouraging Dockless bikeshare for use as a first last mile solution, especially if there is a reduced fare and folks who live further off in the city center aren't necessarily being penalized for not being able to live downtown and having to take a multimodal. So the third sort of operation area that we see is around planning, monitoring, and enforcement. So of course, cities need data in order to effectively monitor and enforce policies. And there's been concerns around inconsistent data submission from operators. And so it's really critical for cities to think about requiring standardized data reporting from operators. So this really gets at establishing a common format that data is submitted to the city in, and common data pieces and timeframes that those are submitted. And then cities may also want to require operators to distribute a user survey, probably on an annual basis. This can be really important at getting at information that isn't necessarily captured in the operator data. So things like user demographics, trip substitution information, so what, where, and why folks are using Dockless bikes compared to other modes. And then finally, user protections. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday. There's kind of two pieces of the user protection element. One is, of course, physical safety of riders while they're riding Dockless bikes. And the other is around financial protections for transactions that are being made in operators' apps. So of course, cities want to think about requiring that safety information is communicated to users in their apps, but also on the bikes themselves, and adopting requirements around equipment and liability standards is pretty straightforward. But cities may also want to think about potentially implementing protections around user deposits. Some markets, operators are moving away from user deposits, so this is a little bit less of a concern. But in markets where user deposits are still being used, there could be an opportunity for protected accounts where these are deposited into, and if an operator were to move out of the market pretty quickly, the city would be able to ensure that those deposits are returned to users. And then the third piece of the policy framework focuses on real-time monitoring and enforcement. And there's really three key elements that are critical to effective monitoring and enforcement. The first is data sharing. Cities really need to be requiring both real-time location data on the location of every bike that's available for rent, as well as historic reports, which I mentioned. These include information like trip origin and destination, routes, even reports on crashes and maintenance. And this information is really critical for cities to be able to evaluate the performance of the system, as well as for decision-making around planning and investments in infrastructure and that sort of thing. It's really important that data is verified by the city and that it's reported in a standardized format. The second really critical piece here is staffing. This kind of gets overlooked a little bit in the conversation around Dockless Bikeshare being completely free to cities. It's actually not. There's in-kind donations, if you will, from the city as far as designating staff to oversee Dockless Bikeshare management. It's our recommendation that at least one full-time staff member from the government is overseeing Dockless Bikeshare. It would be beneficial for this person to have a knowledge of GIS, APIs, and be able to field verify data. And it could also be this person could also be responsible for things like community engagement, education, ridership, encouragement, that sort of thing. And then the final piece in this is the enforcement strategy. Having all of these requirements in place is great, but if they're not being enforced and operators know that, then there's really no incentive to comply with them. So different cities have taken different approaches here. Some use warnings, some implement fines. There could be other penalties like shrinking the size of operators' fleets in order to really incentivize policy compliance. And there's also an opportunity in some cases, if there are fines being used for enforcement, for that revenue to be directed to other related sustainable transportation efforts. So now I want to move into just some lessons for these new mobility services based on what we've learned from Dockless Bikeshare. And the first is designing a pilot. Pilots really give cities an opportunity to communicate their goals with operators, to align operators towards those broader citywide goals that Bikeshare is now keyed into working towards. Pilots also give cities the flexibility to test regulations. If things aren't working, they can adapt them as part of the pilot before implementing more formal regulations. There's an opportunity to establish protocols around data sharing during the pilot, and there's also a chance for cities to evaluate which indicators or metrics that they already collect that might be used to analyze the success of the pilot and eventually the more formalized program. This can sort of develop into a more nimble policy approach to these constantly evolving and changing mobility services. So there have been a number of pilots that cities have done, various related to Dockless Bikeshare, but there's also been pilots around microtransit and TNC's first last mile solutions. As far as lesson 2, understanding costs and needs. This is really critical, like I said, especially in the context of this narrative around Dockless Bikeshare being sort of free to cities. Cities are going to have to use staff time to oversee both pilot implementation and the implementation of an actual permit, as well as outreach to encourage the success of both of those programs. There may be additional infrastructure costs to support a Dockless Bikeshare program or other new mobility program, whether that's looking at parking areas or designated lanes. And then the last piece is that enforcement strategy. There can be costs around conducting enforcement and really needing to understand where funding for those costs is going to come from. There's some good examples of this. I think in Houston, their proposed Dockless regulations tie the size of an operator's fleet to parking area installation. So that's sort of how they're getting at adding additional infrastructure that's going to support the system. And then in LA, their Dockless mobility permit has really clearly defined fees. So there's a permit application fee, there's a program administrative fee, which covers staff time to actually review permit applications. And it's really clear where these fees are going to be deposited into. They have this mobility program fund, and it's really clear and transparent. Lesson 3 is evaluating system performance. This gives cities an opportunity to establish metrics at the start of the pilot, and then, as a baseline, and then be able to evaluate whether those metrics were actually met, and where potentially things fell short. These metrics can be used as evidence for decision-making around additional funding for the program, around questions or decisions around service area expansion, and there could be an opportunity as part of system performance evaluation to consider key performance indicators, and those might be related to climate or health, safety. So a good example of this is in Seattle, after their permit or their pilot program ended earlier this summer. The DOT put together this evaluation report, and this little image is from that report, and they, I think, did a really interesting job of establishing these measures of success. So they have like ridership, equity, safety, a number of these. They established a metric for each of these, and then gave it a score based on the data that they collected throughout the pilot. And you can kind of clearly see which metrics they sort of met their goals on, so for ridership and geographic coverage, and then there's some that they fell a little bit short on. So for example, equity and disabled access. And then lastly, the last kind of lesson that I wanted to discuss is the idea of developing new mobility ecosystems. So this is kind of a newer concept in this space, but really thinking about developing systems and developing institutional capacity that will help to maximize the benefits of new mobility, and thinking through how reducing inefficiencies and silos and bringing together key stakeholders like DOTs, other relevant government agencies, private sector operators, advocates, community residents, all of these different groups that have different goals and different needs when it comes to a new mobility system. Bringing these folks together in order to communicate those needs and really kind of move those forward towards achieving these broader system-wide goals. So a couple of examples of this that's happening in some cities. San Diego just voted to establish a mobility board. So this combines their existing parking advisory board and bicycle advisory board, and also appoints additional representatives from their transit agency and a couple of other agencies to kind of create this, this board of folks who will oversee their mobility, their new mobility, multimodal transportation network decision making. There's a similar development in Dallas. They have a Mobility Solutions Infrastructure and Sustainability Committee as part of their city council is overseeing Dallas's Dockless mobility program. So just to sum up, when we think about Dockless Bikeshare or any sort of emerging privately operated mobility service, the ultimate goal of these is really to decrease single occupancy vehicle trips and increase more sustainable modes of transportation. So when we think about it this way, these emerging modes are more than just a trend or kind of a shiny, new, tech-enabled option. they can actually be critical pieces of a city's transition to a more sustainable transportation network. And so the goals and policy framework that I talked about are kind of steps in that direction. And we feel that cities should think about some of these things in a more holistic way in order to achieve some of these broader goals.